I'm John Chisholm. I'm the Milwaukee County District Attorney. I've been working with the Homicide Review Commission really since its inauguration in 2004. Why did we do it? Number one, the Homicide Review Commission is about the big picture. It's understanding all of the underlying factors that lead to homicide. Homicide has traditionally been one of the major concerns of our community, and we've had persistently high levels of homicide for a long time. Each of us in our own respective fields, whether as a prosecutor or as a police officer, as a judge, as a social worker, would have a deep understanding of the issues that confronted us within our own respective fields. What we generally did not have is sort of the rigor of the public health information to understand why these things were occurring in a relatively small population at such a high persistent rate. That's been the benefit. It's quite frankly been the hope and the promise of the homicide review process, is that we as the public safety officials responsible for addressing the persistently high rates of homicide would address those issues in a reasonable, well-informed way that would actually prevent many of those homicides from occurring if we change policies, if we change practices based on the best information available. So starting in 2004, we engaged in that process, and we've seen tremendous success. We look at it really at three levels. We look at it at the strategic level. What can we do as a system to change things that would impact on homicides? Second, we look at it at an operational level. What can we do among the practitioners themselves to share information and rigorously study how we respond to homicides? And then we even break it down to the tactical level, the street level. Something as simple, for example, as changing patrol patterns to address the chronically high rates of shootings and homicides that occur outside of taverns late at night. We address issues such as having stronger community-based information sources and relationships. It led me, quite frankly, to expand dramatically my community prosecution program, which was predicated on the idea that experienced prosecutors working directly with the community with skilled team members could address many of the underlying problems, particularly as they relate to that decision that's made by primarily young men to pick up a firearm and to get in a situation that ultimately led to serious shootings, homicides, and other consequences. So the homicide review process, in my view, has allowed us to introduce a public health model into the law enforcement setting. Allows us to examine what we do closely and develop policies that are effective and actually work to stabilize the neighborhood. What have been the results? Since starting the program, we've probably made over 100 significant recommendations on how to address things at both the tactical, operational, and strategic level. We've then implemented those, and then we've studied what the result was from our implementing those practices. From 2007 until 2010, we saw significant drops in our homicide rate. Milwaukee, compared to other major urban areas, had a higher per capita homicide rate than many of those areas prior to the inauguration of the homicide review process. Since that time, we've seen dramatic reductions in homicide, and the consequences and the benefits to our community have been immense. Along with that have come reductions in other categories of violent crime, and all of these, I think, are related to one another. The strategies that are implemented are not just about reducing homicide. It's about stabilizing neighborhoods, stabilizing families, and addressing those persistent issues of crime and the consequent fear that's created by that crime, and then helping the community to be involved in the process of reclaiming those neighborhoods and stabilizing them and developing for the future. So that's our experience with the Homicide Review Commission. I understand that many jurisdictions are looking at this as a best practice model, and I encourage them, I strongly encourage, particularly the prosecutors. The prosecutors can play a critical role in supporting this process and adopting sort of the openness and willingness to engage, and then actually implementing many of the recommendations that come forward. We have a strong role to play here. The traditional role of the prosecutor is to take the case once it's brought to us by the police. But through our experience, we know that many of those underlying factors are also our responsibility. About a third of my office addresses issues related to childhood abuse, childhood neglect, delinquency. These are the precursors of homicide. From our studies with the Homicide Review Commission, again, we know if there's any single factor that you can look at to determine whether a person's at risk to be either the victim or the perpetrator of a homicide, it is a life of childhood violence and exposure to that violence. What we do as public safety officials to prevent that can go a long ways to reducing your homicide rates in your respective jurisdiction. So again, I encourage you, I support, and I offer you my experience and insights into this process if you are strongly considering adopting a strategy like the Homicide Review Commission. So in 1999, I was approached and asked to develop a firearms violence reduction program. Traditionally, in the DA's office, we would receive cases and they would be dispersed among many different units, and there was no focused approach on firearms violence. I started that program in late 1999. We called it our Firearms Enforcement Unit. We had a dedicated court at the state level to address the crimes coming in, both misdemeanor and felony. And then a portion of the cases that were the most serious were also transferred to the federal system for federal prosecution. When I first started that program, it was a deterrence-based model. There was no question that we wanted to identify the worst firearm offenders, the greatest threats to our community, and remove them from the community for significant periods of time. What I quickly learned, particularly in talking with young people, many of them who were in our juvenile detention system, is that their thought process often was creating the dynamic that made it almost inevitable that they would encounter police with firearms. And what I mean by that is I would talk to them and ask them some basic questions like do you recognize certain kinds of firearms? And they recognized all of them. Did you have a perception of how many people had been killed in the city? And they always overestimated, many times, sometimes by thousands, the amount of people that had been killed in our city. Then I asked them where they lived, and I would pull out the crime density maps, and they would always point out the highest density of crime areas. And so what I learned from that experience is that where people grow up and their perceptions of the reality of what they're encountering on the street can often inform the decision of whether they pick up the gun in the first place. And again, this was precisely what the advocates from the public health field had told us, that we had to look at it from a prevention standpoint, not just a deterrent standpoint. Oftentimes the damage had already been done. So in doing that, I realized that I had to have a presence in the community, on the streets, and that ultimately led me to the development of the community-based prosecution unit, which would focus not just on violent offenders, but often on the sites where those events were occurring. And so we developed property-based intervention strategies, time, place, and manner approaches to reducing crime, and developed, most importantly, relationships with the people who actually lived in those neighborhoods, with always a focus on identifying the most dangerous elements in the community, but also identifying the resources that we could bring back into that community.